Well, welcome to the podcast. My name is Father Bill W. I'm an Episcopal priest here in Austin, Texas, and also a recovered alcoholic, and coming up 49 years at the end of next month. And then the big 5-0 is looming in the future. Kind of looking forward to that one. Anyway, if you have not done so already, I'd encourage you to please go and visit our website. It's called Two-Way Prayer. And also, while you're there, be sure to sign up for our newsletter. I do they call it a letter from Father Bill, but I try to take a subject and go a little bit deeper into it. So I'm just finishing up one on the 5 C's of the Oxford group, and I think you may find it interesting. So, and you can also get the older copies there on the Two-Way Prayer website. Thinking about, what are these podcasts about? They're really for people who want to go deeper in 12-step recovery. And I think I focus on 2 ways of going deeper. One is through the history, because I think if we understand the history, at least this was certainly true for me, it opened up a very different understanding to the steps and the program and the spirituality that is really underlying all of this. And the second is I've been deeply influenced by Jungian psychology, and so I try to mix that in as well, and talk to people who have more expertise than myself in that area, and take some books and go deeper in those. Jung had a profound impact on the beginnings of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I don't think we're kind of done with him yet. So hope you find these episodes to be of interest. And in this series, I'm really kind of combining both, because it's both history and a much deeper understanding of what is at work in the depths, really, of the 12-step program. And we're looking at Tom Powers, who was a sponsee and close friend of AA co-founder Bill Wilson. And Tom helped Bill write the second edition of the big book, AA Comes of Age, and perhaps most influentially, the book 12 Steps and 12 Traditions. And that's become kind of a recovery classic out there. And obviously, Tom was a great writer and a deep thinker. And so we're going through the book that Tom authored himself, called Invitation to a Great Experiment. And we will have a link for purchasing that in the show notes that will accompany the podcast. And my guest in this series is a good friend of mine, Matt D. from upstate New York. And Matt is the head of a group called All Addicts Anonymous. And that's a group that Tom founded, and trying to keep alive the pioneer program before it started getting watered down, as programs tend to do. It just seems to be the nature of spiritual institutions, organizations. They start off with a rip-roaring beginning, and over time they tend to atrophy a little bit. And that was Tom's experience was. And so how to get down to the really deep nitty-gritty of it, and in doing so, revive it. So want to welcome you back, Matt. And I really appreciate you taking the time to share your knowledge and your experience with us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, been a great guest, and getting a lot of nice comments on the information you're passing on to people. And so I think we're heading into some really deep waters in these next 2 episodes, and I'm glad to have your expertise with us, because I'm going to lean on you kind of heavily in this. So this is part of Tom's book that deals with God's will, how to know it and how to do it. And I thought I'd kick things off with a short reading just to kind of set the tone. Tom writes this. He says, "Do you want to succeed in life? Do you want to be really happy? It's very simple to attain these goals. Just know the will of God and do it. The will of God is the door to our heart's desire. It is the true answer. It is what we all have to do. But how do you know God's will, and how do you do it? And then he goes on, somewhat startlingly, says fact number one is that in our normal state, we do not know the will of God and cannot know it. What's he getting at here, Matt?
Yeah. So I know that sounds like a tricky one because, and actually I've heard you talk about it before. In a way, I think he goes into great detail to talk about previous to this in states of consciousness, in awareness, and I think that the truth of the matter is that to try to do God's will, I think first of all he talks about God's. There's a place in here where he's referring to the actual work of Christ himself, of healing the sick and giving sight to the blind and raising the dead.
What he says, if we were really in touch with God's will and really out there doing it, these are the kind of things we'd be doing.
He then says, good Lord, millions of us can't even stop lying or masturbating or backbiting or overeating for a few days or weeks on end. Other millions sunk in such miseries do not even hope or try to break out. And yet we have quick and easy courses for knowing and doing the divine will. And I think what he's saying is that this thing of, I'm going to do God's will is not that cheap.
Right.
It's not always that cheap. And I think I wanted to say a mention to the beginning. This thing is called God's will is the door and prayer is the key. And there's this phrase, one of the names of God in the big book is employer. We have a new employer. And the fact of the matter is that if you show up on a job and you don't report yourself to the boss and say, what is it that you want me to do today? You don't have a very effective relationship with your boss. There is a special connection in the program between step 3 and step 11.
We really have it kind of reversed. We show up for work and we tell God what his work is for that day. Make my life smooth. Make this happen and that happen.
That's
then
exactly
come on back. I got a few more things for you to do later on.
Absolutely. I had a friend in the program many years ago. He used to say that if I treated my neighbor in the way in which I treat God, I only knock on his door when I need his help and I don't pay any attention to him the rest of the time. My neighbor would think very lowly of me, Right. And I think what this book does is it very often tries to get us back to basics. We start off with self-honesty. We start off in spiritual kindergarten. It's trying to say, look, this lofty idea that we're carrying out God's will, it may not be that cheap all the time. And I think I wanted to say one other thing that I thought was important for addicts. When you get to the 11th step, it says knowledge of God's will for you. And then it says the power to carry it out. And I think that there's a combination of the two. I know backbiting is not a good thing to do. I know overeating is not a good thing for me to do. There's so many things that I know are contrary to God's will. And I think that it's important to remember this is a combination between both knowing and having the power to carry it out. Just because I know it doesn't mean I'm doing it. Right. And it's that second part. We really need the power to do it. For the longest time, I knew, my addictive behavior was totally out of line if there was a God. And it is that second part that I think is so critical for us, getting the power.
Yes, I look back on my life, and what I knew when I first got sober was two things. and I knew them deeply. One was and I'm talking about what is God's will for me, and one was do not drink. Sick as I was, there was no way I could twist that around and get it into my mind that it's God's will for me to go take a drink.
Yeah.
That I got that. The second one was a little more elusive, but it was just as important. It was don't run. Don't run.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was a runner, and
Yeah.
and it wasn't going to work for me if I did not go through it. Couldn't go around it, over it, under it. Had to go through it. So don't run. And I
Yeah.
knew those were God's will,
Yeah.
and that was a lot.
Yeah.
That was a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when they said more will be revealed, man, they weren't kidding.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, but that his will goes a lot deeper, and that's I think what Tom is getting at here, that we are very much asleep in our consciousness, and we're
Yes.
just beginning to wake up, and he's also making the point that we're fallen creatures,
Yeah.
and pay attention to that there's something, something rotten here in the state of Denmark and beyond, Shakespeare said,
Yes. Yes.
and we need to know that, and understand that at deep levels. Yeah.
The introduction of the third step in the big book, it always starts you out with this idea of the reverse. This is what selfish self-centeredness looks like. This is what egotism looks like.
Right.
And I think that's the kind of shock treatment that you're given here, because we normally think, oh well, I didn't drink today, I didn't punch anybody in the eye, I didn't kick my dog,
Yeah.
I didn't cheat on my taxes or anything, I'm doing God's will.
Right.
And I think when you start out from the other way around, just like the big book does, like this is selfish self-centeredness, this is what that looks like, before you get to the quick assumption, just like this book does in the beginning about being honest. If you give a quick yes to I am honest, you
Right.
most certainly are going to find out that is not an actual true statement, And I think that the actual will of God is the uncheapest, if that is a word, of all things on earth. And a quick yes to, oh yes, I am doing this thing. We're probably, with a little investigation, going to find out there are some major areas in our life. Well, when you do your regular daily 10 step, and you go back and look, you're like, oh my God, I backed it. How often do I talk about doing God's will? Like if I was to compare it to the job, this third and 11 step relationship, how often did I even remember my boss? How often did I even remember the assignments that he's given me? Maybe 3 minutes, not even 3 minutes of the day. Maybe.
Well, and this is why the Oxford Group people strongly recommended writing the guidance down.
Yeah.
Because what I've made a habit of is I go back the next day, and to pick up on what you're saying, and I may have had guidance to do 6 or 7 things, and sometimes I'll look at it and maybe I've done 3, or maybe I've done 2, or maybe I've done none. And it's like, there I am in God's presence, receiving God's guidance, writing it down, and then telling him who's really in charge.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. And there's this important, when you write it down, or when this is what I found for myself. I've actually, I tried to do this Oxford Group practice, this quiet time. I'm trying to do the quiet time, and I found that I would pray, I would have these really great openings and terrific experiences. I'd walk out of my house and I would forget all about God all day. I'd get caught up into this or that or whatever else. And I started to incorporate like an actual prayer time in the middle of my day, throughout my job. And the idea is, I think, similar to this one where when you write this stuff down, you've got, if conscious contact is the power to carry it out, the best thread I can connect from my morning, you want to have some kind of a thread, I guess is what I mean to say, through your day. because otherwise you can do it and then walk away, close the door, and forget all about it.
Well, if you're in a monastery, they're going to ring the damn bell 7 times to remind you, to come in here and pray. If you're in a Muslim, they're going to get up in the minaret and sound the recording, and everybody drops to their knees. We need that. We need those reminders.
Yeah, that's right. We were talking before about one of the podcasts about the combination of, or the use of the word member, and how that's incorporated in the word remember. If I don't remember that I'm an addict, that I need God, that I desperately need God, I'm, in a way, I am dismembered from this thing. I am cut off from this thing. And lofty statements of how I'm carrying out God's will when I don't even remember him, you can see that how inadequate that is.
Yeah. But to go back to what he said at the very beginning, in one of his opening lines, is real peace is only going to come through this. It's only going to come through this. It's what we're made for. Was the Dylan song. You got to serve somebody. Who's it going to be? That's the human condition, is to be in service to something or someone greater than self. And we will do that.
Yeah. And also, I think this is like it's not a zero-sum game, in the sense that nearness to God's will is transforming and revolutionary. I'm very much nearer to doing God's will any day that I don't take a drink.
That's right. It's a good start.
And nearness is to be honest, nearness is it's so much better than complete and sheer disobedience. To say no, I will run my own life the way that I want.
That's right.
And this is radically different. And I don't want to confuse the two, but I do want to say, where you come to the point of saying, okay, I do not trust myself in the same way, and I do desire to do this thing the way that you would like me to, we're so much closer to doing God's will, so much closer.
And Tom says this, he says, make the best estimate you can, that is necessary, but don't deceive yourself that you know.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
People ask me all the time, how do you know this is God or this is you? When I'm doing the two-way prayer teachings, and I say, I don't know, but I know this: if it's me, it's the best part of me, and I know something more. I know that just by being obedient to it, there's something really helpful that happens inside of me. Whether it's coming from here or there, it doesn't really matter. Obedience is new to me. It's not natural to my ego state.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I often think of this thing of God's will. I don't know, these parables are like, they teach, and they teach people in different ways. Usually, I'm assuming it's because at that time we had farmers, or we had merchants, and we had whatever. And I think that that we're trying to reach people through that, the common day experience.
Yeah.
But ever since I became a parent, I think very much, this idea of relating to God and to trying to do his will. It's an interesting thing. I like, my desire is to teach my children. And early on, when they're first learning, there's things where I will intervene. I may, this, you don't plug, don't touch electric socket, or
right.
here's how you ride your bicycle. There's times as they start to get older, if I was to continue to do certain things of that nature, that it would not hinder their development. So maybe they start to ride their bicycle, but I watch from afar. You know, I've
you got to give them freedom.
Yeah, there is a certain kind of freedom that
Yeah.
is here. And I think when it comes to God's will, I see this with my own account. I've seen it with a lot of sponsees. There's this constant thing. Oh, is this God's will or is this not God's will?
Right.
There's this deep fear to make a mistake.
Yeah.
The only mistake that we really can make is if we disregard something that we know to be true and just willfully go in some way that we know we shouldn't.
Well, that's right. Dr. Bob said something interesting. He said, basically, I'm going to paraphrase, you don't need guidance to decide what's right and what's wrong if you're trying to figure out God's will. God's will is that you do the right thing. But if you're faced with two right things, that's when you need guidance.
Yeah, that's right.
You see?
Yeah, absolutely.
So 99% of my problems are self-created, it's a do the right thing, do the next right thing. But and then there comes when the fork in the road and this is good and that is good. What is the next right thing to do there? Boy, that's the place of real discernment needed for finding God's will. And Wilson said, do the best you can. If you've made up your decision, it looks like this. I've prayed about it. I've talked about it to people. I'm going to go ahead and do it. And I'm going to learn something from it one way or the other, But you can get neurotic trying to exactly know, to the nth degree. Do the best you can.
From time to time, I get a single young sponsee, and they are trying to discern. This is always a tricky one, Oh, God told me I should be marrying this girl over here or something,
right.
And every once in a while there'll be a thing where it just doesn't work out,
right.
And they'll come in with some level of disappointment. I don't know if it's, I hope that it doesn't come off insensitive, but I always try to tell them, rejoice, when something isn't God's will, then rejoice in that too. Mm-hmm. Because that puts you that much closer to knowing and doing,
Mm-hmm.
It's okay. You make the best, as it says here, you make the best, common sense estimate of what you think it may be. You work with the resources, the Oxford group, they had an actual series of things put in place to try to discern what God's will is. They had scripture and they had, inspiration from the Holy Ghost and relating to, talking it out with other people.
Measure it by the four absolutes.
Work with those resources. This book is always talking about that. Get your help from books and from people and from your own truth work.
Right.
Use those resources. Don't be afraid to, as long as you're doing that, don't be afraid to make a mistake, because if you find out that you did, you're just one step closer to knowing what God's will is.
Right. That's right. In the next subsection of this chapter on God's will, he starts talking about that God speaks to us constantly, and he makes the point of speaking to us through reality, the reality that we perceive. I was flying back this morning from Reno, Nevada, spent a week out there babysitting the grandkids. And it was one of those 6 a.m. in the morning flights. It was dark when we took off. And very soon after takeoff, the sun starts peeking through from behind the mountains. And I know you've experienced this, Matt, where it's like for a minute, maybe 2 minutes, I'm in awe of the beauty, of the majesty, of the mystery. I feel like I'm participating in it, and it's those magical kind of moments. And then the sun breaks through, and I lose it. Normal day is here again, but I was in the presence of mystery there for a few moments, and the ego is awed by that.
Yeah.
humbled by
Yeah.
that. Would that it could stay in that relationship. That's the right relationship with the Creator.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And we talked about brother Lawrence before, but that was the
Yeah.
actual experience that broke him into the fourth state of consciousness, where he stayed, most of his life,
Right.
was to know that God's impact on tangible, viewable nature. It's his presence, and it's. I mentioned this in one of the earlier podcasts too. I had a sponsor who was talking about the 10th step, and he was just saying, like, if you're a little kid, would you put your hand in the forbidden cookie jar if your mother was watching? And of course, I would not. And yet, he said, our problem is, and this is the function of step 10, is to remember that God is with us at all times. And it is my state in which I am asleep to that reality almost all day long. And again, to talk about lofty things like doing God's will, I'm not awake to it. But when you have these experiences, again, I probably went an entire decade where I did not wake up to the majesty that we're surrounded in, this creation that's there. And when you first get in the program and you start to wake up, you're like, oh my God, the flowers, the way things smell,
right.
The sounds in the air, the peepers or the birds or whatever. I mean, it is so profound after years of having our spiritual senses muffled by egotism and selfishness and self-concern, to finally have that breakthrough and to hear it. It is literally a spiritual experience to where there's just no words. Like you can't say. All you can do is maybe it breaks into weeping or something, but all you could do is, oh my God.
but lest we go on an ego trip with that, Tom quickly says, but you also need to see it when you're looking at the trash.
Yeah. No, in all things.
In all things. Yeah. Right.
In all things, it is everywhere. It is absolutely everywhere.
Yeah.
Even in the garbage, in the foam, and in the trash. It is his glory is just bursting out through all of it. And I work on a farm, and sometimes I'll be mowing a field or something after the cows have gone through, and it could be large. I might be there for 6 hours, and I'll sit there and I usually get Beethoven going or something in my headphones, and it'll be that all of a sudden it'll break through that probably an hour or 2 hours I hadn't even realized the mountains, the trees, all this reflection of God's, his beauty in creation. Like, holy cow, it's amazing how closed off or unaware I am, or how asleep I am to that.
Right.
And this program really wakes you up to it.
Well, it doesn't have to, though. Many of us still remain asleep, for years, I'm sad to say, But God another quote, God confronts us everywhere. If we even faintly know it, life is full of meaning, satisfaction, and joy. If we do not know it and will not probe it, life is full of frustration, misery, and idiocy.
Yeah. And I think that's where I usually start off finding myself. Mm-hmm. It is first, oh my God, the beauty, and then it is, where have I been?
Yeah,
I've been asleep.
Yeah, that's right. And that's and the first thing you got to do is wake up. Nothing's going to happen until you wake up. So stop blaming yourself for it. It happens when it happens, and it takes what it takes to get us to that point.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Nothing's wasted. You can get very romantic about this God's will business, and I want to go off to a monastery, I want to go on a pilgrimage, I want to do all of this happy stuff. And Tom, as a good contemplative, says, God's hiding in the last place you'd ever think of looking for him. He's right there in your own life, in your own circumstances, and that's where you're going to find him.
Yeah, that's right.
That's where it's going to be.
And I think what it is yeah, it's the mountains and the trees and all that, but it isn't that only. It's now. It's NOW. That's
Right.
what it is.
Yeah.
And it could be in a brick building. It could be, in the middle of a alleyway.
Right.
Like, it doesn't have to be. Of course, these other things make it easier for us to conceptualize and to take in beauty. That's hard to deny. And yet it's the power of meeting him now that actually is what's so profound.
And the painful places, Matt, are where we're going to meet him most deeply.
Yeah. Yeah. He gets into that, where he talks about the will of God in here. And then, every cynic, probably every addict along the way said, if this is God's creation, all the suffering, all the cancer,
right,
the buildings being, burned and little children trapped in it or whatever, if this is God's will, then screw that,
right.
And I do not mean to make light of any of that, but I will say that it is, as you said earlier, God, he efficiently uses all things for good. And even these things that come, if I hadn't had any kind of interruption or things that precede waking me up, when I get squeezed, I wouldn't wake up to his presence. I wouldn't turn to him. That course is a tractor trailer load full of cement with no brakes on a mountain slope going downward. There would be no interruption if it weren't for these things that occurred.
Yeah. I'm reminded of a story told about Jung, where a fella came to his office. He had been seeing him for a long while, and the fella had just gotten a promotion at work and made the vice president of this, that, or the other thing. And he's real excited about it. And he comes in for the session, and Jung says to him, "Well, I don't think we're going to get very much work done today." Meaning you're inflated,
Yeah.
You're not receptive to really the inner work when you're on a high like that.
Yeah.
There's no place for God,
Yep.
But when you're broken, and that's the beautiful thing about addiction, it has the power to break us and to kill us. And we're confronted with that. And that's where many of us meet God for the first time in a genuine way, a real way, an emotional way.
Yeah. Yep. That's right.
Yeah. Here's a nice quote. God Powers has a way with words. He says, thank God the heart of humanity is stirring in its sleep. Many today are seeking, yearning, praying, watching, and listening. But how many truly hear that voice? And how many truly do his will? Few, very few. Let us be ready to give our lives that their number may increase.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge. That's the invitation. And many are called. We're all called, but not that many go through the door, to the depths of the program. I think I mentioned earlier um, my sponsor had a phrase, limited conversions. He said,
Yeah.
AA is filled with limited conversions, Bill.
Yeah.
Be ready for that. People who've gone a certain part of the distance, but then stop.
Yeah.
You know?
Yep.
And Tom's there saying, come on, deeper, deeper, deeper.
Yeah. 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 And you can use, I hate to say it, but it's, you can use your life being put back together. There is, I was kind of struck by this when I first saw it coming into the program. That when I got in first, I was like, the idea here is that I get sober, that I eventually, I have a good job and a house and a wife and a dog and a boat, and the idea is foreign. That idea is foreign to an addict. The whole thing we were trying to seek all along was conscious contact. I mean, we knew that there was some kind of answer in another spiritual dimension the whole time. Now all of a sudden I want to settle down in something below that, and I think I'm going to be happy.
Right. It's not going to work.
It's not going to work.
No.
Yep.
No. Yeah, it's in the now. Whitehead, Leslie Whitehead. Talk to me about the will of God. He makes much of that in this chapter. Are you familiar with that book?
I am.
Okay.
They used to read it. They used to read it in early AA. There's several things he talks about in this section. There's the practice of the presence of God from Brother Lawrence.
Yeah, we'll save him for next time. He's our next episode.
Great. There's the Theologia Germanica with this ego reduction. There's the De Caussade. There's the Way of a Pilgrim. There's all these different books that Tom uses to teach certain practices. On this thing on the will of God, he relies on Dr. Weatherhead's book, The Will of God. And the book was written, actually it was a transcription of sermons that he gave during World War II in London, where all of his parishioners, he saw this cynicism and what do you say, this thing that can happen when suffering comes home. You can be transformed by suffering and become open, or you can become hard bitten. And he saw several of his parishioners who had family members that had died in World War II. In the meantime, everybody's afraid. Bombing is going on in the city, the whole thing. He saw this big, deep spiritual need for his parishioners. And so he started to give these sermons on it, and they were transcribed. And he gives a description of God's will. And he says, if you want to understand God's will, you should understand it as a tertiary thing. It's in three parts. There is God's intentional will, like God never intended me to be an addict. I did things my own way, and there was a result to it that was somewhat devastating. But then there's God's circumstantial will, which is the revision. So there becomes a way to go now that I've turned. The third is God's ultimate will, which is in essence, God always gets his way in the end.
Yeah, that's why he gets to be God and I don't. It's just not fair, Matt.
I know it. Well, when I see, again, there's this is where, like, when I think of my own children, if I'm trying to teach them something when they're young, I really do. I sit over top of them and you do this and you do that. And then at a certain point, you really have to let them screw it up or do it their own way, and to see. And then eventually it does come around that they learn,
It's the only way they're going to learn.
It really is.
They have to break free.
It really is.
You know, Adam, I think, had to screw up in the garden, or consciousness would never happen.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
he'd just be a happy little idiot. You know, but
There,
he gets cast out, and boom, then the relationship with God takes on a whole new meaning that we're
yeah.
still living out. You know,
There's this quote from Saint Anthony the Great. It says that without temptation, no one is saved. You
mm,
know, without, and I would extend it even farther. You know, like without the going to these lower depths like we have. You
right.
know, could we have this opportunity? Like you hear, how often do you hear in the fellowships? I know, I know I had wrecked my life and this wasn't really what I should have done, but I thank God that I found my way into this program and has given me a life better than normal, better than regular.
Right.
I could have never found it unless I had gone to hell first.
And for each individual, uh, they have to go through that process. It's
Yeah.
people would say that when I was counseling in the old days out in treatment center, and so God, I wish I'd gotten here 20 years ago. Someone would say, or 30 years ago, and the answer
Yeah.
was no. You got here right on time. It
Yeah.
took everything that it took for you to get you to where you are.
Yeah.
Now be grateful for that.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
You know?
I may have mentioned this before, but there's one of these George MacDonald books. There's a little girl character, and she's lived on the farm with her mother. The father had died. The mother ends up actually dying, and all she knew was this farm and this beautiful Swiss cow she spent all of her time with. And the farm is sold, and it actually becomes her dowry. She won't have it for many, many years, and goes to live with the only family that's left, and they're rich town folk that are really insensitive and cold and mean. They represent that. And instead of having her live inside the home, they put her up in the attic where
Mm.
it's freezing cold, and she's never been away from the people that she loved. And here she is in this attic by herself as an 8-year-old, and she's the next thing, she's sitting there in this devastating state, and all of a sudden a mouse runs across the floor.
Mm-hmm.
And she weeps and says, she throws out one of these quick prayers that just said, help me.
Mm.
And George MacDonald says, the line that he says is God and his almighty ability could have sent a fiery angel, but instead he sent a cat. And so all of a sudden at the door, appears this cat that chases the mouse away and becomes her companion. And it's just this one little line. You're like, if you didn't pay attention, you just read it and passed right by. And I thought, what is he trying to say there? And I may have said this before, it bears repeating. I always think of God in we always get these different words, almighty and omnipotent and so forth. I never think of him as all efficient, and he uses everything. Everything is used, and he doesn't use any more than he has to,
Mm-hmm.
And I just moved by that idea, that all that happens to in our life, even all of the suffering and everything, when we look at it through our own cynical, truncated glasses,
Right.
it just seems so unfair. But there is something, this kind of suffering that happens, and nobody wants it for themselves, has this corresponding, salvation and release and freedom that can occur. And nobody wants it for themselves, but this thing does happen.
And the only way that makes sense to me is that God is in it with us, suffering right along with
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
Because I used to have, that's why I struggled with Christianity for a long while. It's, it's like if, if the requirement is the killing of your son, there's something wrong with you.
Yeah.
I mean, theologians try to turn it around. There's something wrong with us, and all this grave error, error must be turned around in a divine way. I could never buy that. I just, and I still can't, but that God is with us in the suffering every bit as much as we are suffering. That's a different image of God.
Yeah.
And that's one I can turn to.
And that it isn't the whole, it isn't God's only will, if you will, that the suffering is actually a door to something else.
Right.
That there is, and there is very often no other way to get through that door without it. And you could say, you could throw up your hand. Well, I'm not advocating that anybody take on any kind of religion, that everybody should be open in their own way. But you could throw up your hands with Christianity and go join, Buddhism, where the first noble truth is suffering.
Right.
Like
you're going to hit it.
Where the hell are you going to go in this life to avoid suffering? And actually, is that not the story of an addict?
Right.
They're trying to cheat pain their whole lives.
Yeah.
You're trying to get away from it all the time. And good luck with that one.
And doing nothing but causing more.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
Yep.
I want to close with a summation that leads into the next episode we're going to do. And Tom writes this: 2 revolutionary steps lead from the life of the spiritually dead to the life of the living. 1, realization that we have lost the capacity to know and do the will of God, and that life is fruitless without it. There's that paradox.
Yeah.
And number 2, asking with humility and courage and a sufficient awareness of desperate need that the capacity be restored to us.
Yeah.
It's just beautiful. I don't have it. Someone said, the opposite of faith is certainty. And if you're certain, you don't need faith.
Yeah.
Well, but what you have is not real either.
Yeah. That's why you don't want to approach this stuff in a cheap way, because if you don't have sufficient awareness of your desperate need of it, you'll never ask for the capacity to be restored.
Tom says oftentimes the churches preach crossless Christianity is his phrase.
Yeah.
Crossless Christianity.
Yeah. Everybody's trying to pretty this thing up.
Right. That's right. And God's going to bless you with millions of dollars, my friends. Oh, it's pretty sick. It can get pretty sick. But it's the journey we have to go on, man. So we're digging into this thing. We're exploring it. Probably tick a few people off as we do, but that's okay. Tom did that, didn't he?
He did do that. I mean, if you think about it, if God gave you the capacity to do His will before you woke up,
right,
what kind of a mess would you make?
Right. Yeah.
So that's why, when the ticking of people off, a lot of times it was just the reminder, we need to wake up. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So great.
Okay. Matt, I thank you very much. And I thank you guys out there for listening. I hope we touched on a few subjects that are going to be helpful to you in your own recovery process. And we kind of opened the door a little bit, because for the next episode, I want to get into where Tom is pointing us with all of this stuff. And he says, basically, the answer to this problem is a life of prayer. And what does that look like? And how do you get there? And I'm going to invite you back next week, Matt, and lead us through that chapter. Okay?
That's great.
Okay. Thank you all. God bless, and keep coming back.